we talk about capacity building, what are we really talking about? Giving people the knowledge they need to do their jobs well, whether they're in the public sector or the private sector or in civil society. And in a regional integration context, look, you could talk for hours about this topic of how do you give people skills they need. But in terms of what we're talking about today, a couple of pleas from kind of our perspective. That would be, think small, not big. Think focus. And if you're thinking about capacity building, don't do it in terms of an abstract notion, but around specific, and in this case, viable commercial opportunities. And that is to say, we're not going to build, continent-wide capacity of public, private, and civil society actors unless we start by doing it in the context of a specific project, project by project, identify the project, learn from doing, and then do it again. So, and again, the private sector mentality, I think, has to inform all of this, because what we're talking about is developing commercial opportunities. So, what do I mean when I say think small, think focused? In a regional context, you can think in terms of, for example, a focus on particular transport corridors. And there's a lot of talk about north-south corridors. The Maputo corridor was sort of tried and tried again at various points. There's the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor for Tanzania. That's one way of focusing attention of public, private, and civil society actors around what are the capacities needed to execute there. Think about economic processing zones. That's another way of thinking about it. Think about regional value chains, but very specific ones. What are the opportunities for tourism in East Africa? What about for soy in Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe? What are the opportunities for livestock or for staple crops broadly in Southern Africa? But be focused on specific opportunities that have real commercial viability. It's in that context, it's going to be in the context actually learning by doing that people's skills will develop. I think another thing I'd add to that is when planning for these things, have a private sector mentality that says, we're not going to put together a project. Let's start with, we're going to put together a business plan. We're going to say, what is the specific market? Who are our customers for this project? What's the product that we're going to get to them, and what are its product characteristics? How much are we going to invest? Be specific. And what specific returns are we looking for? And to think of it in kind of business planning terms, this sort of learning by doing approach to capacity building. Ownership. Who owns the program? And in this case, I'd really make the plea for, in many cases, what you need is real champions, high-level, even heads of state sponsors for these kind of regional integration efforts that I'm talking about. And whether that's, President Kikwete, his sponsorship of the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor. I know President Chizano himself tried to get behind the Maputo corridor. I know that President Zuma has talked about sponsorship of a north-south corridor. But who is the high-level champion for actually making these regional integration programs happen? And then in a very private sector way say, who's in charge, who's accountable, what deliverables, and by what date, and then hold people to those milestones. Because without it, responsibility becomes diffuse. There is very little accountability. We come to these capacity building endeavors with very good intentions, but in the end we have nothing to show for it. And then from that point, it's a matter of execution. From that point on this question of champions, I just make one plea here, and that's a broad policy plea. That's if we're going to focus on, say, soy or livestock, whatever, can we, at a very high sort of head of a state level, there has to be some notion that we're going to have consistent application of policy. I think the hardest thing in these regional integration plays is not sort of, here's what our policy on particular tariffs or particular trade or non-trade barriers, but the consistent application of policy. So around specific opportunities, can we have consistent commitment to and consistent application of policy in that context? A couple of examples of what I think have the potential to be very effective regional integration plays around capacity building. I'd mentioned the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania. That itself brings industry to the table. Unilever, it's Syngenta, it's Yara, it's the government of Tanzania, President Kikwete himself being out there on the line saying, we commit to the development of this corridor. Here's what we expect to deliver. It's AGRA, big NGOs, civil society being brought to the table, not just in Tanzania, but ultimately in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and beyond. That has, I think, been set up the right way. That can be a model for capacity building in a regional context, something actually we're working on in Technoserve. Another quick example, the Africa Soy Alliance. It brings industry to the table. It brings actual entrepreneurs and small business owners, millers to the table. It brings government to the table to say, what's the opportunity for real regional integration here around soy with specific targets? Here's what we aspire to do together on the topic of a regional commercial opportunity. Here's how we're going to make good on it. Just a summation. One is be focused. Two, make it about commercial viability, real commercial viability for people to make money. Three, let's be focused on ownership and accountability, real focus on results and transparency. Four, and in all of this, this is all about training in context. It's about capacity building around specific set of deliverables. And then five, I'd come back to this, consistent policy, consistently applied across the region.
Bruce, would you like to take the question on entrepreneurship and mentoring?
Yeah, just a quick comment on entrepreneurship. I think it is certainly the case around the capacity building questions around entrepreneurship, that there are ways to sort of take on capacity building even for entrepreneurs, and a couple things I suggest. One, we talked about project-specific initiatives here. Well, in the context of, say, agricultural development or corridor development or infrastructure development, I think it behooves us to take explicit stock of what are the opportunities actually for SMEs or for entrepreneur-driven businesses around those. Sometimes the inquiry just ends at building the road or getting in place basic extension services for agriculture, but it could extend in the agriculture context to entrepreneur small business opportunities around input supply, around ag extension, around transport services, infrastructure the same way. What are the set of goods and services that small businesses could be providing? Jeff talked about tourism, about 80% of actually the economic benefits redounding to small and medium-sized business owners. Well, what are the capacity building programs around that? I often say that there's, I don't know if entrepreneurs are born or made, but there's nothing intuitive about growing a business and about having the business skills to do it. So being very explicit about there's some capacity building, there's training, there's technical assistance that you have to get to small business owners in that context is important. And then I think finally a focus on entrepreneurial finance. How do you actually think in this context about equity for small business owners? There's very little actually startup or risk capital, equity capital available for entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa. Similarly, how do we think about low transaction cost models for creating credit to small business owners where they just do not have credit? That is in fact the missing middle in terms of finance and access to finance for business creation and development in Africa.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.